Sounds good. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for coming. When the director presents, I always get nervous that this need to be full. So it makes me happy to see all your beautiful faces here this morning. I know you all know Oliver really well, but I am going to go through his bio just a little bit. So we have it both for some people that are joining us online and just in general, so you can see where we're at. And first, I want to just talk about a second here. Very much multitasking. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen, the Songhees, and the Esquimalt peoples on whose territory the university stands, and the Lekwungen and Wasanic people whose historical relationship with this land continue to this day. So Oliver joined CFGS in 2012, and as most of you now know, he just recently got extended one more year. He spent a year a sabbatical, so they've extended his terms. So yay, we get to have him for a year. He has a few hats: professor in history and in political science. He has held the Jean Monnet Chair in European history and politics, and as a European scholar has been really instrumental in building the European Studies program as its former director, and then taking a lead role in promoting European studies in Canada, and 15 years now co-lead of the Europe-Canada network we call UConnect here. All of his research interests are broad, but they include contemporary European politics and comparative history, European integration, the political sociology of migration, integration and ethnic conflict, and the role of identities and collective memory in modern societies. Currently, he holds various research grants from the EU and Jean Monnet and Schmidtke, and looking at issues of migration, right-wing populism, and the politics of memory. And just in case you don't all see him, he also does several media. He really sees himself as a public scholar, which I really appreciate about you all for sharing what you know, both with the media and in general, trying to make sure that scholarly knowledge is accessible. So today's talk is on the Populist challenge to democracy. Like Ivan said, happy Wednesday chatting, evidence from Europe and ways to rethink democratic practice. And then Oliver's going to lead us in kind of two discussions. We'll follow that first, and then we'll do a little bit more of trying to draw in our audience for some thinking about CFGS in the future. Over to you, Oliver.
Thank you, Jody. It's I asked to jointly think about a research agenda, so I'm glad to see man and woman power here in the room. So I will do something which is maybe a bit, hopefully not too ambitious, but I would like to set the agenda on something that's probably on not everybody's but most people's mind, which is the crisis of democracy, if we want to call it this way. I then give you a sense a bit of what we've learned from the project that I've been involved in recently, comparative politics in the European context. And then just to prove that I also do more focused research, I give you a short glimpse into a research paper that I recently published that looks at a particular case, the AfD in Germany, Alternative for Germany, very contemporary. I'll tell you a little bit about the political fights going on in Germany and Europe more broadly. And then I would like to open it up. And I thought, now with this 1 year mandate as a director, there might be an opportunity to launch either a joint grant or a fundraising campaign at the center, probably starting this summer, to think about, do we have something collectively in common in terms of thinking about democracy, democratic governance, decision-making, citizenship. So I give you some hints of where I think this can go. And please bear with me, this won't be, not all the answers, I'm not sure who joked with me before, will be on the table, but it's more a start of a conversation. I really hope to do this over the next couple of weeks and months, and just so if you have great ideas afterwards, let me know. And I'll come back and circle back to you, illustrious. So I have the clicker here. So first off, let me briefly introduce what is at stake. And I think there is broad awareness of some of the issues. It's a creeping process that we've seen here some evidence of a decline in the quality of democracy. It is not a radical shift, but one that has been evolving over the past 15, 20 years. And we see in particular a sharp drop, and that's something, a research that still needs to be done, or you might know the impact of COVID and the pandemic on the quality of democratic decision-making, democratic governments. But you see here a real, drop in those qualities of freedom and democratic practice around the world. And you can see this also here. This is a study of Freedom House looking at what the literature calls the backsliding of democracy, the quality of democracy in terms of fundamental democratic values and institutional practices. And you can see here also over the past, since 2005, there's been a real drop in the quality of democratic decision-making. And it is a marked difference to think back to where we were in the 1990s with some form of triumphalism. Liberal democracy was identified as the only legitimate and maybe feasible form of governance. We are far beyond this, and what we've seen after a huge expansion of liberal democracy, in particular in the former Soviet world, we now see a gradual decline in the quality of these newly established or long-established liberal democracies around the world. That has also sparked the interest of the scholarly community, and once you have a book like the Levitsky Seeblatt being an international bestseller, it gives you a sense that the public has started to listen. It is not only a scholarly debate about, what is democratic, how do we see democracies. I think there is a heightened sense of an urgency to address an issue that forms in a way the foundation of how we live as a political community. So how democracies die. So history, when have democracies failed? Also by governments legitimately voted into office and then eroding the very foundations of a democracy that brought them to power. And so you can see some of the themes here. And this one will be one here, the people versus democracy. That will be one theme that I will investigate when I come to my own research. The claim of populists, particularly right-wing populists, to be the voice of the people, a different form of democratic will formation, decision-making that challenges some of the foundational elements of liberal democracy and the parliamentary system as we know it. It's not new, those of you who have been at it, know that the crisis of democracy is a long-standing issue. We've seen this. This goes back to a trilateral commission on the crisis of democracy back in the 1970s under the Carter administration. Some leading political scientists were summoned to write about the state of democracy. And interestingly enough, their idea about a crisis of democracy was very different. Was basically the claim there was too much democracy to have an effective government, too many players at stake, and the need to restore the authority of government to make effective decisions. So that was the perspective in the 1970s. So you can see already here, the balance between democratic participation, forms of intervention by the people, so to speak, and the ability to govern. That's a long-standing issue, and you see here issues of legitimacy, tyranny of the majority, violation of rights of minorities. Democracy has never been perfect, right? And I don't want to quote Churchill yet again. That's probably the most imperfect but the best form of governance that we have. But clearly, what it is as well, and I will come to this in a second. It's also a matter of an evolving institutional practice, and so here. It was democracy is becoming ungovernable. Maybe we're at a point again, but with a very different diagnosis and of where the crisis comes from that challenges the democratic regime. I'm already exhausted now here. So what are we facing now? those of you who were here a year ago, I talked more about the force behind the crisis of democracy. But one thing that speaks to the last issue, intergovernmentability. What we face today is a sense of, that's a term that makes around in public debate as well, the poly-crisis, right? There seems to be an overburden or an exhaustion in terms of addressing fundamental crises that we face, from the environmental crisis, war, to the financial system, extremism. All these things come at the same time, and there is a decreasing trust in governments to face those effectively, or simply there's an exhaustion with politics and a desire for easy answers to very complex issues that informs also competitive party politics and democratic decision-making. And this comes against the background of a long-lasting development, that Peter Mayer, some of you might know, has worked on those issues of how the trust in our parliamentary system, in particular key institutions that in a way form the decision-making process, parties, parliament, all those institutions that in a way reproduce our democratic life, that this trust has eroded over time. So remember, he was a professor at the EUI where I did my PhD, and he talked about the crisis of democracy, and they said, what are you talking about? Maybe he was just too early in his diagnosis, but he really saw that, he called it the hollowing out of democracy or ruling the void. We still have the institutional arrangement of liberal democracy in place, competitive party politics, elections, and then forming governments, the executive, and so forth, but really that the trust in those very actors and institutions has declined to a degree where there is a greater hunger for an appetite for alternative ways of enacting democratic decision-making. Those actors that traditionally have carried, in a way, the load of installing also a form of democratic governments no longer seem to be attractive. And so, in a way, the rising attractiveness of non-democratic forms of governance, it might be something that follows up in a reaction to this decline of trust, but it in a way accelerates this very notion that we can trust those who we vote into office. And you can see here, this is a Eurobarometer study from 2021, trust in democracy. And if you go around the continent, sorry, I don't have those numbers for North America, certain European bias here that I bring. But you can see here, first of all, I'm not sure whether you see this as encouraging or discouraging, but you can, on average, roughly, the half of the population still is satisfied with democracy. But then you can see clusters, right? A relatively high degree of satisfaction in the north of Northern Europe, and then going down to the south, but also an east-west divide in terms of trust. And then you have a cluster of countries back here, Bulgaria, Romania, and Greece, where trust in democracy is down to 30%, 1/3 of the population trust democracy. So these are not very encouraging numbers. This is a context in which now new political entrepreneurs enter the scene and have something else to offer. And when they say, you parties, you no longer represent the will of the people, you can see that it speaks to a long-established sense of suspicion or mistrust that has grown over the years. This one here is a bit dated, the Pew Research Global Attitude Survey. You might have seen those. This is, people were asked, I'm not sure you can see this, whether the rule by military, strong leaders, or experts would be a legitimate alternative to what we have at the moment. And you can see here, in terms of a greater desire for what we normally would call non-democratic forms of governance, there is an appetite for this. In particular here, if you look, strong leader. Japan, maybe not surprisingly, the UK, 26% say maybe a strong leader would be a legitimate and desirable form of governance for us. Normally I don't have much reason to be so proud of Germany, but it's here, maybe some lessons from history have been learned. But you can see here how, there is also here the sense of being ruled by experts as something that is seen with some degree of openness and endorsement by the population. Now, at the same, oh yeah, sorry, yeah, one more before. This here now gives you a sense of the alternative that has arisen in terms of political entrepreneurs filling the void that Peter Mayer, I think, so accurately diagnosed. And you can see here that across the continent, right-wing, the far right-wing nationalist populists have attracted a substantial degree of support. In particular, in these two countries here, that's a bit dated because Poland just had elections, so it, it is no longer governed. But you can see here, Fidesz was just re-elected in Hungary, has established now a long-lasting political regime in this country. In Poland, after 8 years of peace government, they were elected out, which is actually quite astonishing, considering how systematically they tried to also suppress opposition and use state authority to make elections less competitive, let me call it this way. But you can see here, it is a phenomenon across the continent. We see now, I'm not sure how to characterize Giorgia Meloni, but she comes out of a fascist past and now claiming to be more conservative. But here we see authoritarian tendencies that representatives of the extreme right represent, finding more acceptance and also support in election across Europe. At the same time, I think there's a growing awareness across the continent that this might pose a challenge. This is a picture before the last election in Poland, where over 1 million people came to the center of Warsaw and protested against peace, its way of, in a way, capturing the state and implementing also anti-democratic measures. The independence of the judiciary, of media, were curtailed. If you follow Polish politics now for the election, it's fascinating to see how difficult it is to roll this back. That's another issue. A degree of also concern and willingness to engage in the Polish capital. This is a picture of Hamburg, so a hotel in Germany just last week. Over the past 2 or 3 weeks, there have been demonstrations all over Germany, from small cities to big cities. They had to close down those in Berlin and Hamburg because simply too many people came. Over 2 million people have been in the streets to demonstrate for democracy and against the AfD, because it became obvious, and that was investigative journalist who brought up this issue, that the AfD attended, or representatives of the party attended a meeting near Berlin in which they discussed re-immigration, basically the forceful deportation of people with a migrant background from Germany into the future, over 2 million people, even those with German passports and citizenship. And so as a reaction to this, for the first time, so many people came out to demonstrate and made their voice heard. What it means, I'll leave this open, but you can see here there is a massive public reaction at the moment. In Germany, Poland was another example. So it is a matter of major public debate in this respect. So now changing slightly. Now things get a bit more serious. I need to look at my notes. Not too serious. So what we've learned also of a study that we conducted with the Ucanet project that Jody mentioned here is how, if you think about democracy, right? Lincoln, democracy in governments by the people, of the people, for the people, right? It seems to be pretty straightforward what democracy is. We have, as political scientists, we teach this in our introductory classes. Democracy is a set of institutional arrangements. But really, what this also means is it is part of the political imagination of those people who live democracy. It is not a set form of how we organize our polity, but it's also a matter of what we project into what democracy is. And I think here, one of those citations, the political imaginary that informs what people expect from democratic. And we did this comparative, first let me go here, and that goes back to the demonstration in Berlin and Hamburg, talking about the role in which, also collective memory, our collective past inform our choices for democracy. So two competing narratives here based on history in the German demonstration. This one here, never again is now. So clearly reference to the Holocaust, the rise of the extreme right, and the long established notion of how do we learn from history, the dramatic history in Germany with the rise of the National Socialists and the Holocaust. Here again, never again, 1933. That was a recurrent theme in those demonstrations, right? The collective past and how we could use this knowledge to prevent the decline of democracy, stop the decline of democracy. Here is a different one. And by the way, when you look at the extreme right, it's quite amazing always to see only men here, and it's more women on the other ones, but that's a side observation. But anyway, so here, these more angry-looking men, they come up with a different symbolism that is rooted in a collective past, which is, we are the people. This is a slogan that the dissidents and the opposition against communism used in 1989, claiming that we are the people and we are suppressed by an authoritarian government, the current government, right? Different narratives of who the people are and who should be empowered. And here it is, basically, we live like in times of 1989 again, and we need to free the will of the people. Let me just broaden this perspective a bit to what we did in this comparative project. We worked together with scholars in France, in Hungary, and in Poland. And it was quite astounding to see how the very notion of what the sovereignty of the people ought to mean varies across Europe. In the West, we have, the reference to the Holocaust, to the experience of extreme nationalism and racism, informs concepts of democracy. Liberal democracy is all about fundamental rights that need to be protected from state power. It is, in this respect, a form of governance that ultimately serves the purpose to in a way, be protected against authoritarian tendencies, with the ultimate reference point of individual rights as the anchor. In the East, in Eastern Europe, we have a different kind of narrative that is, again, steeped deeply in history, but it's not the Holocaust. It's not the Second World War and the rise of National Socialism, but the experience of Soviet occupation. And the main notion here is democracy means, and the sovereignty of the people means freedom from external rule. And for this, you would need to, in a way, have a strong leadership. And nationalism here is not the potential threat to democracy, extreme form of nationalism, but rather the foundation and the very notion of what promotes popular sovereignty, independence, freedom. Freedom is tied to, in a way, a strong sense of national pride and also, a sense of national sovereignty. Quite different from the notion of liberal democracy, so much anchored in individual rights. So that was, for us, interesting to see. And, I could now, spend an hour talking about this picture here, how Viktor Orban in Hungary has, in a way, generated an historical narrative that puts Hungary into the position of being continuously threatened from outside, not having its proper role in history, being, in a way, humiliated in history by losing all the territory, and then the need for strong leadership to reinstate the glory and pride of the Hungarian nation. And that is a very strong narrative that then also justifies more authoritarian forms of governing the country that, if you look at it from the perspective of liberal democracy, would be seen as non-justifiable or against the very notion of what democracy stands for. And it's just today, so if you read the Guardian this morning, the EU now starts taking action against the sovereignty law. And it might be a small thing. The Hungarian government has launched an initiative to allow state authorities to surveil and to investigate Hungarian citizens operating in the public arena, in the public sphere. Always a fear that they could jeopardize the dominant narrative and probably pose a threat to the Hungarian political community. So it is, quite a coherent narrative established based on history, but with a very particular aspiration in terms of how to govern a country. So this brings me now to the article that I'm going to very briefly discuss, and I know I can't do much. Oh, it's happened already. Okay, so I'll be relatively brief and then lead over into the discussion. So this is what I tried to do in this article that was published in Social and Legal Studies a year ago, was to see, is there a core of the political aspiration of populist movements? Because populism is often described, and for good reason, as a kind of protest vote, as a rejection of traditional politics, anti-establishment, but it doesn't seem to have a very coherent ideology. It's a thin veiled, ideology, as some scholars would describe it. And so, but they claim and make reference to the very core of what democracy stands for. We are the voice of the people. We are the genuine voice of the people that should, in a way, find proper representation of the political system. So, two questions that I had was, one, is there a coherent sense of the political project that populists have? I mean, very broad questions. And is there a notion of how the system of government should be reorganized, the constitutional vision of populists? Because if you look at the program of populists, they're all over the place, right? As you know, they can come from the left to the right, but even within the nationalist populist movement, if you look at welfare state, the role of the state, there is a whole variety. Is there something as a core that speaks to the issue of putting into jeopardy democracy, that we can identify? Some people would argue populists basically are a reminder to liberal democracy to reform properly, or are like a mirror that throws back the inefficiencies and the need to reform the current practices. But it seems, and I would argue, there is more of a coherent vision. And what I did, and now it's, excuse me for this. So what I did, and I can speak about the methodology, but I don't want to bore you with this in order to have the time. Essentially, I looked at key campaigns, looking at parliamentary speeches, programs, social media statements, and looked at what were the main themes based on which the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, conducted its political mobilization. And so there's migration, globalization, which is also called the role of international companies, Europe, the role of the European Union, and last year, COVID, only in 22, you can just 2015, 18, and 21. And sure enough, during the so-called refugee crisis, that's what made the AfD big, right? They responded to the influx, or massive influx of refugees coming into Europe 15, 16. And that was their single most important message and political campaign, after almost falling back into irrelevance because their the prior mobilization didn't resonate. And you can see here how this has gone down, the emphasis on migration, Europe, the critique of the European Union, entering and illegitimately controlling affairs. Remember the narrative of Eastern Europe? We have won now the independence from the Soviet Union, and now we have another actor coming in here called the European Union, trying to impose its will. Very forceful in Poland. The governing party went so far to say, what we see now is the Germans try to establish the Fourth Reich, but they do it through economic means, through the European Union. Anti-German, anti-EU, and you see similar reactions here in the case of the AfD. So now you have to forgive me, I just showed you what I did, and I really, want to come to the summary and, some general insight. So what I did is looking at the sovereignty of the people. What does it mean? How is it being diagnosed? And you have here the different themes. And here I look at the alleged threat to this very community of the people. Who are the people whose rights are violated? Drawing on a definition of populism. The elites responsible for the existential threat. You can see already a theme emerging here, and then the suggested remedy. But I'm happy to share this to give you a sense of some of the key campaigns that run quite effectively. But one of the things that emerged here was not too surprisingly, looking at a populist actor. It wasn't so much about a coherent policy agenda, how to address the issue at the border. We have this in the US at the moment, or what to do about international capital inequality and all those things that are in people's minds. The essential way of conducting these campaigns by the AfD was informed by a sense of continual crisis, existential crisis facing the people. So it wasn't, this and this, this or the other policy option, but a fundamental threat to the integrity, the interest and identity of the people. There was always, the notion, if you listen to the rhetoric of populist forces around the world, go to Trump, right? It's always about, the decay, the collapse of America if those people come to power, right? It's never really, the border becomes really the symbolic reference for who we are as Americans, who we don't want, right? And not so much about effective policies at the border. Now, let me jump. Could you move this?
I'm going back.
No, not backwards, no, never. Okay, so now I distill.
Sorry, I have a different.
Okay, go up. No, Jim will come last.
Sorry.
Because I knew that.
Just, there we go. There.
No, there go top. I think we missed. No, go first. No. You're already get a peek review of what I'm going to say, right? Okay, great. So, so the things that I distilled from my case study of the AfD, one was that the notion of popular sovereignty as compared to a form of liberal democracy through established institutional arrangements of defining the will of the people for elections and so forth, is a pretty coherent form of challenging what the will of the people is. And it is highly emotionally charged, that's through all the campaigns. The way to make it resonate was this deep sense of disempowerment, the frustration with those people not being able to have their will heard, the sense of disenfranchisement in the current system, and the claim that as an alternative, those populist forces could articulate the immediate will of the people. Immediately, not through the complicated process of election and parliamentary debates and so forth and coalition building, but that there is a different, more immediate and more legitimate and more satisfying way to articulate what the people want, the voice of the people, the vox populi. And how these campaigns are being framed is with respect to this perpetual state of exception, that politics is all about fundamental decision against or for the will and the real interest of the people. And in a way, what is baked into how these issues are being portrayed and the recipes for addressing them that are presented, how this is done is in a way that parliamentary democracies are fundamentally unable to address those issues. We need a different form of political authority to, in a way, guard the interest of the people. There is a clear contempt for the rules of parliamentary democracy. They make fun of them, and that's something that you see even if they are voted into office. the sense that this is a legitimate process of democratic governance is undermined by, in a way, portraying those very institutions and processes as not sufficient, satisfying, legitimate, and that something else, a more immediate representation of the people is being needed. And the foundation for this, one is liberal democracy is not able to do this properly. And those of you who are trained in political theory, some in the room here, you would immediately see how this resonates with a political philosopher, theorist, and legal scholar in the Weimar Republic, Carl Schmidt, who wrote about the concept of the political, but also a fundamental critique of parliamentary democracy. Remember the 75 trilateral report, not being able to govern. Here you have a very more fundamental critique of parliamentary democracy. And when you listen to public debates, it's often going back, do we see in 1933 again, do we Hitler marching as A in the streets? But if you look at the intellectual reference that become apparent in how the AfD and other right-wing populist actors conduct their political mobilization, the reference to this line of thought that a parliamentary democracy is inherently weak, not able to defend the sovereign rights of the people, and that to have the political will, the sovereign who decides in the state of exception, as he puts it, you need a homogeneous people, you need a united people. And that goes back to something else that shines through everything that, when you read through their manifestations and how they frame issues in public life, is how there's a very, if you live in this constant state of exception, a constant existential crisis that faces the community, you need to be united. And it often is done with respect to identifying enemies, foes on the one hand, and friends and insiders on the other. So the notion of a homogeneous, ideally culturally homogeneous people is the foundation and the prerequisite for giving a proper voice to the people. And so it's not by accident the affinity to nativist ideologies that we find in populist movements. Sure enough, you could argue, look, there's leftist populists, right, who think critically about parliamentary democracy and say, no, it's all about reproduction of power. We need a different way of giving a voice, a proper, more authentic voice to the people. But in the right-wing iteration, you see this legacy of a nativist extremely, the notion of nationalism that is exclusionary, and the identification of folks is a fundamental driving force in the political mobilization. And with this, gradually, I transition over. You will see a little bit. Still doesn't like me. Sense of sovereignty as the ultimate authority to decide in a situation that is always, the invocation in the. Yeah,
It's me. Sorry.
The reliance on individual rights that liberal democracy has leaves in a way a vacuum that the left, for example, progressive forces haven't been able to fill. A credible notion of community within which people engage, in which they articulate their political wills, in which they participate. Sure enough, and that is, the notion that populists, right-wing populists put forth, is definitely they don't have any mechanisms of how the will of the people is being go here, to up. 25, yeah, almost there, guys. So it is more no, to up. So I get extra minutes for that, right?
You get as many minutes as you want over.
So, it is more a performative invocation of the voice of the people because there is no mechanism. It is more a sense of supporting a strong, charismatic leader, the sense of strong leadership that we saw before, right? This is being enacted. And, the claim that I, as the leader of this country, I directly represent the people. Think about why does Trump go to all these public events, right? It is exactly the sense of, oh, I represent the will of the people. It's acclamation. There's no mechanism of harvesting the will of the people along those lines. And what I would suggest, and you can see here, thinking about alternative ways of considering democratic governance. Of what democracy is about, the rule of the people, by the people, for the people. What does it mean in practice, right? And to further then, so in this respect, the idea of what would be proper ways of capturing the collective memory, what are the institutions and actors that could do this? And there is, if you think about democracy, look at these demonstrations, it's often with reference to a shared collective past. What do we learn from history? Where do we want to go? And that could be a fascinating way of thinking comparatively about democracy. The other one is, and I'm working on a book manuscript. Don't expect me to present it next year, maybe give me another year or so, to think about community as a concept that is fundamental for our politics, for governance. And to think about how community can be thought from more leftist progressive perspective, not leave the imaginary of what is the community to right-wing ideas about national exclusionary ideologies, but rather take the sense of community seriously. I know there's been lots being written about the common good and the communities that needs to support this, but to see whether there could be a different way of conceptualizing these communities and linking them to democratic practices, drawing also on indigenous knowledges, think about community now in our political science reality, often exclusively tied to the nation state. Maybe there are transnational forms of political community in the European context that's quite feasible, and actually just completing an article with Fazada on this, right, how NGOs and civil society organizations operate at the European level and what they bring in terms of democratizing government structures in a context where there's lots of pressure coming from authoritarian government. So this notion also of commitment to an engagement in their own community, this is something that we at the center, right? It could be something through your own work with communities, and community engagement is a strong thing that we pursue here at the center. Could this be something to think about more systematically, right? About these forms, and then reimagining citizenship in engaged actively engaged citizens. Yet again, I think there is a void in terms of allowing this form of political engagement to flourish. There's a huge desire, I think, on behalf of citizens, but often there's no real sense. And what we have now, this void is being filled by social media, by exactly these kind of imaginaries that are based often on radical confrontation, on identifying enemies and so forth. And Jim just recently, there you go. Jim, you just recently sent me an article about thinking, for example, about environmental or climate change citizenship, right? So the holy price that we face to have an opening for citizens to be engaged more robustly than simply being spectators in this. And so this is, the CTI, with the Cedar Tree Institute, we started to consider what new innovative forms of democratic practice could look like beyond the state-centered approach. And so continuing this line of reasoning and relating it to political practices could be, I think, something that the center, with all its different interests, might be something that I would like to invite you to think about. And with this, one thing I thought, can you go to the next slide?
It's there, it's just not video.
So Jim, you have to remember now what you said. Jim said he would come, so I give you a sense of, should I read it, of his public philosophy, because in a way it is thinking about, public philosophy in those terms, and in terms of participation in dialogues and negotiations over how and by whom power is exercised over us, constitutes our identities as citizens and generates bonds of solidarity and sense of belonging to the political association. The sense of belonging to the community, the sense of being engaged, meaningfully engaged in this decision-making process, I think is a rare thing to find these days. There is a great, I think, desire on behalf of the population and citizens to be this, but in a way, our idea of what the community is, it has been occupied by other political forces. And so I think that might be a creative thing, of a way of considering the future of democracies in different forms, and hopefully more fruitful ones than claiming to be the direct voice of the people, and then basically using this as a pretext for establishing rather authoritarian top-down approaches to governing a country. All right, with this, sorry it can be a bit long, but hopefully I get given you some ideas. I can expand what I've done in this paper, but I'm also happy to think, if it resonates, with you, to think about democracy along those lines, particularly with the communal idea, right? Recapturing the idea of what political community is and how it can be enacted in political practice. All right, I'll leave it here. Thank you.
You're getting waves from Bud and Irving.
All right, okay. All right, I'm sure the two of them are very engaged in thinking about democracy in the education. So that's an example, right? So democratize knowledge, right? Education, that was, you can immediately go to the project that Bud has with the UNESCO chair, right? To think about how do you make knowledge accessible and in a way meaningful for different constituents. That would be one way, right? So education is a key, I think, element, thinking about different forms of democratic practice.
My job for once, I get to be a thinker and press you a little bit. Obviously, it was a great talk. I really appreciate how you kind of put it all in context and use the really grounding of what's happening in Europe in a real way. But if I were to be a bit argumentative,
Oh, I know you are.
can we not believe that democracy has always been fragile? So we know that.
Yeah.
It's partially because it never delivers what we want, right? So at best, maybe it's a fair distribution of disappointment. That's it working well. So we kind of accept that. Then how do we know what you're currently talking about is really just sick? Like we all get sick and you get better, or is it terminal, which is kind of what you're suggesting? Because if it's terminal, we have to behave quite differently, and we have to be much more interventionist. Because I can moorings, we have these groups promising these things that we can't possibly do as democracy and the same dialogue. And so I'm wondering if you can maybe just expand a little bit on how do you know that what you're talking about now is really serious versus just sort of the standard cold season that all democracies and all political systems go through? Some get sick, some get better.
I wish I could share your optimism, right? But I can definitely see the argument, right? That maybe we go through a period of where institutional arrangements have run their course, and now we need to, in a way, rethink, certain aspects of how we organize our democracy. So what you described, always fragile and always, evolving, right? You could say there are principles, but really how we have enacted democracy over the centuries, it's very different, right? And so in political science, we tend to think about one model, but really it is a practice that evolves. So what I just see at the moment is a deliberate attempt in the name of democracy and democratically legitimated through elections of governments to systematically do away with some of the fundamental rights and arrangements that we have for making democracy work and giving these systems the democratic quality that we normally cherish. So go around Europe, but Bolsonaro in Brazil, in Russia, Putin also elected, right? Arguably, being a democracy, but the systematic use of state authority once in government of those political leaders to, in a way, erode, the very democratic procedures, based on which they were elected to government, independence of the media, judiciary. Then, you think about social media, fake news, and so forth, right? I think we are at I think maybe it sells better in academia, you could say, but I think there is a juncture in terms of where we're at with respect to the risk. And in the post-war period, we could take things for granted because there was a more limited set of liberal democracies that were, in a way, that had an established sense of what needs to be done, and a kind of passive and deliberate consensus of the population that this is a bad thing, right? Looking at the communist alternative, right? So there was a general permissive consensus about these rules. I think that is being questioned now, maybe for good reason. Maybe liberal democracy hasn't delivered. That's very much also part of this, right? Peter Mayer's diagnosis. But I think we've definitely reached the end of an era. We are still living, all of this traditional legitimacy, and as Peter Mayer calls it, a hollowing out of these practices that less and less people see it properly represented, right? The anger that you find and all this, right? So what quality has this reached? Is this a pervasive force across the globe, right? Is it individual countries that are more vulnerable? Post-communist, no long established sense of democracy, not a very active citizenry. So all these, it's possible, right? And some people would argue we survived the one Trump presidency due to the robustness of the division of power, the independence of the judiciary in the US and so forth, right? But I wouldn't bet my money on this, to be honest, and in particular with respect to the United States, right? Think about the United States, what you want, but it used to have a leadership position. Like, can you imagine, right, the United States going down a more authoritarian path? I think that would set the agenda around the world, right, in a very dangerous way. So maybe that's a pessimist in me, but I just see that there's enough of a of development across, in particular, the Western world, right? The disillusionment with democracy, the lack of alternatives, and then the void being filled by authoritarian recipes. Hopefully I'm wrong, but that's how I read at least current politics.
We have one online. Do you mind if I pop in here? So I'm just going to read Janine's question out here out loud. Janine says, I like the idea of more participation as a way to safeguard and develop democracy. However, how do we deal with populists hijacking these participatory processes?
Good question. Yeah, it's I think what we've seen, now we have a track record of these populist parties coming to government, right, at different levels, right, at the municipal, regional, and national level. And what we've often realized is once they take power or are involved in some kind of arrangement, there's a real void and incompetency, that is often shocking to realize. People are often quite disappointed once these forces get into government because they don't have anything to offer. Their whole notion of an eternal, this state of exception, the emotional fight against the alleged enemies of the people, it doesn't work as a recipe, right? Once they have to work in the community, I think it is, a sobering experience for them to be confronted with real problems, with real process of collective decision making. And I'm relatively optimistic that it will be very hard to hijack these things. I think once people work on a common cause and they are committed to this, it generates its own notion of commitment, its values and its practices. I think there's sufficient experiments in political science and evidence that once people become engaged, it develops its own dynamic. Older experiment you might have heard about, you give people just a newspaper to read, and after a couple of weeks, they develop an amazing sense of interest in politics and become engaged. So small things, and I think these community engagement, once it is done systematically and once people feel ownership, it will be very hard to see individuals. You always have these people who are finding with everything, particularly the German case. But that's but I don't see this. Janine is a good point, right? How do you do this on the ground? But often these populists, they don't like this, right? They want to be in the echo chamber. They wouldn't really go there unless they have a good try to capture this. But I would be more optimistic about how an on the ground form of community engagement would be relatively robust to defend and to protect democratic participation.
I'm gonna jump down to Amanda and Stan and then Ivan.
My question is kind of related to Janine's. You had also talked about the erosion of community engagement and citizenship, the responsibility of citizens to their democratic processes, and I'm wondering what do you think is contributing to that lack of engagement? When really the stronghold is in terms of communities coming together.
It is, I think, at the moment, a sense of being overwhelmed by the crisis that we face, and the sense of it doesn't make any difference from what I do. Because that's, think about, the pandemic was a good example, but the environmental crisis, right? The sense of helplessness and the sense of vulnerability that prevents people from engaging, right? What difference would it make, right? Is there any proper mode for me to engage? And so I think there is lots of evidence that people take ownership over very local things, right? How can we possibly scale this up, right? Sorry, I mentioned the idea of climate or environmental citizenship, right? So to in a way think about not only the local, but use this as a model to take ownership over issues that are global in scale, right? It is difficult, right? Because it is often so remote. You feel, what difference do we make? But I think that is, for me, the best mechanism to bring people back into some form of engagement. And sure enough, then you have also the social media bubble, right, that people have escaped into. That is so comforting because you don't listen really to other voices. I think that's a skill that is critical for democratic deliberation, and also to listen to and interact with people whom we don't tend to agree with, right? It's rare that we find these occasions anymore. It seems now where I can definitely see what it has been a systematic process, but you see in times of crisis, often people are willing to engage, right? And I'm just maybe I read too much into this, but to see so many people coming out, small town East German towns that are dominated by the right-wing AfD, right? They gain 35%, 40% support in those. They came out, right, with anti-fascist slogans and all this. So I think you can tap into people's passions and willingness to do this. But it's just a mechanism that we need to think about. And that's in a way an open question, like, how do you do this? We all have limited time, resources, right? Maybe political scientists who think we need constantly involved citizens always participating, that's not realistic either, right? That's maybe, a social movement perspective that, is hard to sustain. But, to think about how people can take ownership over their common affairs, right? And how do we define the community, right? It could be the local level, but then clearly, you have to think about democracy working at different levels. And there are, I think, good examples, but I hear your voice of concern, right? How we've been also trained to be passive, right? Citizens. We're called upon every 4 years to vote, but then often it's a matter of let's trust those in power. And that is the background also of the mistrust and the disenchantment, with the current political system. So in a way, the rise of populist forces reflect real problems in democracy, right? And how we are engaged and how we feel we have ownership.
Thanks, Amanda. Stan, do you want to chip in?
Yeah, so thanks for I'm going to stand up because I will speak over as much as said. Yeah, thanks for the talk. So maybe I'm betraying my professional bias against democratic politics, which I mostly see as creating various forms of inefficiencies and market failures which can't navigate human welfare. But my general question concerns the solution that you propose. Right? So there are various things that we know about how deliberative and communitarian politics work, right? So we know that they're very often hijacked by political entrepreneurs who use them to secure various forms of rents, right? It's symbolic or economic. We know that all these local deliberative forums are usually only used by people who have already certain forms of social and economic capital, especially the capacity to speak in public, the capacity to articulate their opinions, and so on. We also know that, contrary to what you say, I actually disagree with you when you say that people are seeking for engagement. I have read, I think, mapping and convincing evidence that it's not the case. Most people are avoiding conflicts. Most people are actively developing life strategies to avoid interacting with people they disagree with, right? So I'm not sure a lot of people are actually going to volunteer to participate in these forms of deliberative forums and so on, right? So I was wondering what is your take on this, right? So I'm not sure the cure you are recommending for the rise of liberalism is an effective one. The second question I was wondering is, is democracy worth? It's still maybe like a big question, right? So is democracy worth saving? Because democracy is as useful as its capacity to protect individual rights and this narrative, right? And so liberalism is an outgrowth of democracy, as you mentioned yourself. It's more like this idea that, the popular sovereignty is trampling over these individual rights. Well, maybe we have to admit that this system has lived and that we need to find something better, something that does a better job at protecting these rights. Right?
Okay.
Yeah, so these are the questions.
Oh, easy questions,
Wow.
right? Yeah, but no, it's as you know, there are these arguments. Think about the environmental crisis. Maybe we need authoritarian regimes to tackle those more effectively, and that goes back to the older criticism of democracy, the crisis, right, in terms of effective decision making. And that I think is a fundamental conundrum that it's very hard to solve, right? And clearly grassroots initiatives, community-based, they're chaotic, they are hard to manage, and they're not very effective in producing, let's say, policies, decision, and so forth.
So just in Victoria, they're very good at creating zoning legislation which are responsible for homelessness crisis, right? So this is great. This is what local democracy gives to you, right?
But then if you think about the scale of the policy decisions that we need to take, right? So there is a clear disconnect, and that's more. I don't have the silver bullet, right, that allows you to do this, but in a way to say no, but what would be the basis of decision making that comes from above, right? That is more effective, maybe, but who defines the values by which these decisions are being guided? By whom it serves, and so forth, right? So I'm always deeply skeptical to think about non-democratic forms of governance, that are allegedly sure enough more effective and more better at producing outcomes, because in the end, it would be hard to imagine that this would not be exploited by relatively small elites, right? They would serve their own interest, but you're right, maybe it is. For us political scientists and scholars more broadly, we operate within an idealistic version of what local grassroots engagement is all about. Again, we have to have a realistic, but that's exactly where I would like to start a conversation. Right? What could these forms of political community look like? Right? Sure enough, you referenced the local one, but also more generally, right? So could we, to have this kind of buy-in, the taken ownership, the overcoming the sense of being so far detached from the decision-making process. Are there mechanisms to allow this without always bringing people into, one room and let them fight it out together? We know that that doesn't work, right? For example, think about citizens' assembly. These are all forms of experimenting with this. In Germany, they just had 400 or 300 randomly selected citizens meet for 2 months to think about food security and food policies, right? And outside of parliament, randomly selected, all represent a broad swath of the population, and they came up with very interesting recommendations. Right? A different process. I'm just giving you examples of how we can widen democratic practices that are not only focused on political elites, right? And often, I think the diagnosis, most decisions are being taken behind closed doors, right? Now in the parliamentary system, so the deficiencies are pretty clear. I don't have a good recipe as such, right? But I think it might work through giving meaning and empowering communities. Something that, I think the desire for community, if you look why people flock to these right-wing populists, right? I think it is the promise. You'll be taken seriously, you're being recognized, you're an Hungarian Pole, right? There is, a sense of pride and taken, right? Liberal democracy is not very good at doing this, at providing a sense of a meaningful community over which you have ownership, you share the concerns you're engaged in, right? And I think this void, we need to think about clearly, but I can definitely see the skepticism, how to put this into practice, right? All right, we're political scientists, we think about it.
Can I just have 2 seconds?
sure.
2 seconds.
Yeah, 2 seconds. So when I'm saying that finding a replacement regime, I'm not talking about enlightened philosophical kings, right?
Oh, I thought you as a philosopher.
Yeah, so there's an amazing book by Gary Jones called 10% Less Democracy, Why the World Would Be a Better Place if it were 10% less democratic. It's an amazing, a whole bunch of amazing ideas there, how to make Western countries 10% less democratic and hence much better at functioning.
Okay, thanks.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, this is I kind of just want to keep it does occur to me, you talked about this, the existential, that this actually tying into the existential issue of some kind. It seems to me that the more importance that particular existential issue has for us, or at least for me, the more comfortable I am with authoritative efficiency. So, for example, you said the environmental crisis, and like, oh yeah, well, if we could fix climate change 5 years by putting the right person in power, I might just go for that. So, but that wasn't really my question. My question had more to do with the this whole, and partly because I saw somewhere this sort of the notion of the role the center could play, or the way the center might think about the next year and so on. It's when I think about these questions, I'm also thinking about this whole issue of tribe and why, and belonging, and why, and the vulnerability that comes with that, so that the mischief makers, or whatever we want to call them, that will use power, would want to get a hold of power for nefarious reasons, are taking advantage of the fact that a bunch of people don't feel like they belong in an engaged way in modern democracies. Right? That's what's. And I've become less interested in trying to figure out what's wrong with them, and more interested in what's wrong with us. And the thing that I'm particularly focused on is the way we talk about these things, and the way we act when people do almost come into the room, to quickly send them flying to another place where they get a better sense of belonging, because we immediately use words that alienate them from the process of change they might be going through, or the openness, like the word phobic, for example, to me is a loaded term. I come from a psychological background. It actually means something pretty specific. And yet we throw it around when people start moving through a process or asking questions about a whole range of issues. That immediately makes them, I believe, feel alienated from that conversation. So anyway, and there's a whole, it just seems to me that leadership around how we create the spaces in between the groups, and how you, and the kind of language you use and all, is something that universities can take and a center like this can take a much bigger role in.
It's a very good point, and that would be probably another lecture and another discussion, how we see identity politics in a way reproducing these relatively isolated communities, that are exclusive, and do we find a kind of universalistic approach that brings in people, beyond the divisions that we have, right? And what we see at the moment, we go down a road where we're very compartmentalized communities, right? That operate on the basis of exclusion, right? And that's a tendency that we've seen in politics. The notion of what the community I think about ideally would be exactly be a way of overcoming this, right? I think people interacting, maybe you have different experience. Once you allow people to interact, some of those prejudices or they go away very quickly. But we don't really have many opportunities to interact outside our bubbles or families or maybe these kind of communities. So I think this practice of democratic engagement, right, is really missing. And how can we find spaces for making this work without exactly what you described, right? That you dismiss the others, that it's not belonging, not properly here, not having a voice, not having a stake in this. And unfortunately, we have seen lots of those kind of camps setting up shop and saying, no, you're not supposed to be here, you're not one of us, right? And the left is definitely has been promoting this as well as the right, and so that's a very serious problem. It goes a bit, but it's a great point. But that is, how do we make these communities inclusive enough for people to finally think that have a place there, right? Otherwise, if they walk in and get described, immediately dismissed. That's a very good point.
Colin, you wanted to jump in maybe, and then we'll go to Kelly.
Yeah, sure. One of your early slides, you showed some of these slides about the erosion of democracy, and I was noting the dates where this was purported to have been 2005, something like that. Facebook started in 2004. And so there's something to be said here about the power of social networking and social media in this conversation. Correlation isn't causation, obviously, but it's difficult for me to figure out or to understand that this rise in right-wing populism would not have occurred with the same level of intensity without social networks and without the filter bubbles and echo chambers and the confirmation bias that those networks produce and intensify, right? So that then leads to, and certainly I would argue that some of the people who have come to power would not have come to power without those modes of communication. I don't think Bolsonaro would have come to power without WhatsApp. Trump wouldn't have come to power without the micro-targeting that occurred on Facebook. Brexit would have happened, in my judgment. Who knows, but that's it. So anyway, I just wondered whether you could throw in some thoughts there about solutions here and about the way that when you're talking about building communities, there's loads of communities around the world. It's not a question of building communities. There's loads of communities on Facebook, on WhatsApp, on wherever, right? Whatever the latest, fad in social networks are. But it seems to me that that is a crucial part of the puzzle here. And it's not just a question of regulating social networks so that they're better in creating communities, because they do a great job in creating communities, right? So I'm not sure there's a question there, but I'd be interested in your reflections.
You're all asking for solutions, that's the most difficult part, I suppose.
No,
yeah.
It's a question really of thinking about that issue as part of the diagnosis of the problem. And you're focusing quite rightly on grand historical narratives and looking back at the Second World War or whatever and saying, aha, there's a connection there. And I'm saying, well, yeah, there is, but that connection is filtered through this contemporary social networks we have, and therefore it's likely to be very, very different.
No, I agree. And then if you think about the evolution of democracy, and this is a new form of engagement, communication, deliberation, the last citation we just saw from Jim here, right? So when we talk about deliberation, for example, if you think about Habermas, right, the public sphere, how it all came to being, but the foundation of our democracy is basically a bunch of intellectuals getting together in coffee houses and start deliberating ideas, right? And then it's expanded through mass media, right? And then, he was already quite critical when, the television and the different mass media. Now we have a new level of ways in which people get their information about politics and engage in debates, right? Yeah, so in a way, the medium itself changes politics and democratic deliberation fundamentally. So I'm totally with you here to say it is a new form, right? And definitely, when we think about, one thing would be to say, tangible interaction of people, right? Yeah, we need to go back to this. That would be more when you leave your bubbles, right? But that's not realistic. That is how people, in a way, are educated, right? So in a way, we need to figure in virtual communities. But that's also could be an opportunity here. If we think about the limitations of local engagement, right? So really get together in your village, it's always contentious and difficult. But virtual media at least offers us new opportunities to engage, meet people, interact. But there are the pitfalls, right? And with fake news and whatever is coming next in terms of AI generated images and so forth, I think we're down a very precarious path. So I agree with you, right? That is crucial, but communication, interaction, it is now mediated through a new form of communication. There is no easy way out. My expertise is limited, right? To studying this, and you're more, the expert here, but that is, I think, a fundamental issue here. I looked at, how, in a way, maybe that is why populists could use social media so effectively, right? Because it is suitable for their dramatic political communication, the sense of perpetual crises, existential crisis. Social media is very good at amplifying, these things and, in a way undermining, more conventional ways of pragmatic solution seeking and so forth. So maybe there is something built into this very medium that allows a certain way political communication has gone, but it's, I'm happy to think about.
And selective use of historical example, very, very selective, that goes viral, etc. And is amplified in such a way that it creates that sense of grievance and community. That is very, very different.
You want to jump in? And then we have one from Kelly.
Yeah, sorry.
Kelly, yes.
Okay.
Maybe building on a lot of the conversation, I appreciated early in your slide and a few times, Oliver, you mentioned something about emotions and as fuel. And to me, I think in these sort of rational constructs that we come up with in Western philosophy and Western institutions, etc., we acknowledge that piece, but we don't actually investigate and see the power and social media, for example. So what gives us a sense of belonging? Part of that's emotional. What gives the power and inflames? Part of that's emotional. I would say actually a big part of it's emotional. So I'm really interested in that dimension, and I hear a lot of it in even, as we speak in the room, but we socially in our society, mainstream society, we don't tend to explicitly acknowledge this dimension. But this would be very interesting, I think, to see whether there's a way to explicitly investigate the emotional dimension, the power, the power of that.
Right.
So in a solution-oriented way, solutions to, I guess, at least not ignore that the potential of a more systematic, explicit investigation of that dimension and how that is turning into all of this.
Maybe I could respond to your question by citing, one researcher with whom we worked in Poland. He said, look, what piece the government has been able to do quite effectively is to create these kind of emotional bond for the population. So what these forms of populist nationalist rhetoric can achieve is to emotionally invest people, right? We are threatened from outside with all the enemies around us. We just regained our independence. You need to invest here, right? Give us the license to protect the sovereignty. This emotional bond is often lacking, as there's no real alternative, right? When, for example, when Habermas suggested the constitutional patriotism, right? Patriotism should be based on our rights, right, on our constitution. You can see, it lacks the emotional robustness that draws people in. And politics is about emotions, right? I think every politician will tell you this. It's about a good narrative and the emotions attached to it. And that is something, but I think, and that's why I want to focus on communities. I think the sense of belonging and being invested in a community can produce these probably less adversarial and more positive emotional ties to a collective that is based on shared interests, shared values, and so forth. But I can definitely see that how this is being reproduced, and the social media is perfect, right, for this. They know how to play with emotions, to steer them up, right, to dramatize, and it's a real challenge, right, to think about democratic forms of deliberation and decision making in an environment in which you have these forces coming to bear, right, and creating this highly emotionally charged, dramatized notion of what politics is all about. So I can see, and I agree, right? It is about, also the emotional investment that you have. It might come through individual issues, right? So from the environment, so that could be one to draw people in and to be emotionally invested. I'm just thinking out loud here, right? What could be, in a way, challenging, the more negative reference to the national community, which is always depicted in an existential crisis and needs to be protected. Right?
Can I just add to that? And part of that, I think, is understanding the neurobiology of emotion. We can't understand new information and work with information if we're in particular emotional states. So understanding that as part of the design of the engagement process, for example, could be really helpful.
Right.
Yeah. Or the intent.
We have 5 minutes, and we have Martin and then Laura, and then you put your hand up, right, Laura?
And
Yes or no?
I'm good.
Mark,
You're good?
then back
Okay.
in the
Oh.
room there.
And then Bridget, and then we'll maybe sneak you in. Yeah. Okay, Martin, you go.
We got the corner later anyway, so we'll bullet this deal. We'll go to the microphone.
I'm not sure I can do it in 30 seconds, but I think we have a laboratory right here. You mentioned, local communities building these things from the base up. And I've watched a progressive democratic deficit here. I mean, I've been around a while, but dial back 30, 40 years or so, we used to elect hospital boards. We used to elect politicians for every 2 years, locally. We used to elect our CRD. You can go through a whole lot of these institutions which have essentially, democratized or evaporated. We have a very good example at the moment where under our current local municipal council, they've decided not to appoint to a whole slew of advisory committees. I have to go and speak to them in a couple of weeks. I'm allowed 3 minutes.
Wow.
And they wanted to bring in a rule that I could only come every 2 months. It did fail, but if you spoke for 3 minutes once, you could only come in 2 months. And well, they're absolutely delighted, of course, that we don't have to have rezoning hearings now, right? So, the positive side to it, of course, the NIMBYism that creeps through residential neighborhoods and whatnot, and you have to do something about it. Well, it's being done, so we'll see. But it's a good point about environmentalism, because I've had to do I'm in the middle of it actually, an inventory of local groups engaged with the environment. I'm up to over 100. And they thrive, and it's everything from little groups of invasive weed pullers, to and located here in Victoria, there's some organizations with not just a regional but a national reach. So I mean, this vast panoply of and
they function and they do their job extremely well.
Right.
And God help you if you twig enough of them that they have a powerful voice, even though they're not, there's no environmental panel or something that rules locally over them. So I think you're on to something. And yet, on the other hand, boy, we really do have to think about how we organize ourselves at the community level. And what's happening here is you can drive an arc right the way through the provinces. No different anywhere else. So,
Do you mind if I just grab Laura's and Bridget's question? You can answer
Yeah.
however you want.
Yeah, and then if you wanna grab some other stuff.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, Laura, you're next.
No, I think it's been addressed. It's all right. You can.
We've asked Bridget, you want to jump in?
Thanks. So all my background's like in environmental stuff, so I'm very familiar with the Austrian argument of,
Mhm.
a small collective being able to manage things effectively together. So I guess when I think of how that translates into democracy, like when you scale that up, yes, you do have that power of voice, but there's also other seats of power. Like you have lobbying, you have industry, so all my work is in, community engagement, like it's what I like, it's what I think is very effective. But when we think of actual government, how do we balance the will of like a community and even, opposing those? How do you balance that with money, essentially?
And I'm gonna do a plug really quickly because Carolina is talking next week. And she works with community-based research and traditionally excluded social groups. And she was saying that it's a struggle to bring them to debate and make them visible to society. So we're thinking about that scaling and thinking about those individuals as well. So there you go. You get the last word.
How do we confront power, right? Yeah, so it's an eternal question in political science, but it's definitely right. And, I think the frustration of contemporary democracy is also that people realize that where power sits at the moment is often out of reach, of conventional democratic decision-making. Think about the European Union, right? Many decisions in terms of regulations and policies are being decided in Brussels and, they're now implemented, right? So look at global power in terms of money and corporate power, right? It is beyond the reach of our nationally organized democratic forms of governance, right? So the mismatch between real power on the one hand and the form of democratic intervention that we have, I think is driving also the crisis that's been described here. How do you reconcile this, right here? So it is, then the whole issue of competing claims of communities, we see this, when we talk about indigenous politics, right? It's not easy, right? And it's not the silver bullet, right, to think about communities along those lines. But, it's the notion that democratic accountability needs to be extended to certain things. And who else would articulate this? It seems parties have largely given up on these things. So it's just a matter, clearly then we would need to institutionalize this. We can't rely on community groups, right, to do this. But I think there is currently a void also in party politics. The left has basically the center left has given up on certain issues. For good reasons, right? And that is, I think the communal setting might be a way of addressing this, but that is on the one hand, Colin, I think your point about social media and giving platforms to all these different groups, right? It's a plethora and a cacophony of voices out there and communities that compete for attention and visibility and all of this, right? Is this a new form of democracy, we live in? That's I can give you so many research projects now after having listened to you, right? But I don't have easy solutions, but clearly the way we communicate, the way we interact, the way we define communities, I think that will be at the core of some of the answers to the conundrum that democracy faces at the moment.
Thank
All right.
you, Laura.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for joining us.